Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name's Manveen. I'm the L&D manager here at the Managing General Agents Association, the MGA. Before we start and I hand over to our presenters for today, just a few housekeeping points, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but always worth just covering. Please do keep your microphone and camera off during the session. You'll notice that you might not actually be able to use your microphone and camera at the moment. Please note if there are any moments for you to interact with us, we will obviously turn your microphone and camera on as necessary, but there is the chat function available. We do ask that you not use any note-taking tools as we don't have permission to use this. As ever, these sessions are recorded and a link will be made available to those after the event. And we'll have a quick survey as well. So we do appreciate if you could spend a few moments at the end of the session just providing your feedback. Should take no more than a few minutes, but just make sure that we continue delivering relevant content. That leaves me to hand over to Helen and the team at Pro Global for today's session. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Manveen, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our MGAA market briefing series, and I'm joined by 2 experts from Pro Global today. I'm moderating today's session, which is called Managing Operational Resilience and Third-Party Vendor Risks 101. What are the solutions? So some of you may remember before the festive break, in part 1, we explored the challenges of building and demonstrating operational resilience, and that included fragmented oversight, evolving regulatory expectations, and the practicalities of managing critical vendor relationships under frameworks like DORA and the FCA's operational resilience requirements. So today we're just going to move that discussion along from the challenge to action. We'll be looking at what effective due diligence and resilience management actually look like in practice, what tools and processes can make oversight continuous rather than periodic, how technology can simplify audit and compliance evidence collection, and how MGAs can strengthen governance without overcomplicating their operations. So first I'm going to hand over and introduce our experts. Perhaps Christy, you could go first.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for joining. I'm Christy. I am the Group CTO here at Pro. I head up obviously all of our technology, but also the way we look at client solutions. And really ingrained within that is how we think about operational resilience and what we can do from a technical standpoint to assist in that process. And just making sure that any of our strategies really align with the regulations and compliance that we need to. And then I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Christy, and lovely to see so many people here today as a nice follow on from the last session. So I'm Mike Dozzell. I head up the Pro's governance, risk and compliance function. So I do work quite closely with Christy, particularly around things like data and resilience, third parties, that sort of thing. So, and I think you'll see some of that coming out today. But resilience is something that my team, focus on. And you'll see why as we go through the session. As I said, it's something that's but we look obviously at the due diligence side and things like that, which are all part of that resilience. So look forward to talking to you in a minute.
Absolutely. So thanks, guys. And as they say, we're going to go through a series of case studies illustrating how companies are translating these regulatory expectations into measurable, auditable resilience frameworks. After that, there'll be a bit of a discussion, and we'd like to leave some time at the end for an audience Q&A. But to kick things off, we'd also like to ask you a poll question at the start of proceedings, and then we're going to ask you the same questions again at the end. And just going to compare the sentiment, how that changes over the course of this discussion. So fingers on your buttons to vote, please. Without further ado, here's the poll. Please do vote on your screens when that's live, and we'll just have a little look at the answers. So the question will be, I think you can see it in the meeting chat there now. Where do you see the greatest opportunity for improvement in your current operational approach? Data quality and visibility, continuous vendor oversight, governance and accountability, technology enablement, or all of the above? I can see some votes are coming in. Thank you. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And you'll see the reasoning behind this in a minute, but initial thoughts, Mike and Christy, can you see in the meeting chat the results coming through?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, and I'm not surprised, but I think let's see, we're going to touch on all of those different aspects, I think, throughout the presentation. So it'd be interesting to see how you think, if you still feel the same at the end.
Absolutely interesting to see so many on data quality and visibility at this stage as well, actually. Any initial takeaways on those results? They've come in 36 responses so far from you, Christy.
No, I think it's in line with expectations. Obviously, data quality really is key here, and that continual vendor oversight, it's quite a task. So we're looking to look at those in more detail through the session.
Absolutely. I think it really helps us focus now to start this session on that continuous improvement, as you say. So let's begin. Let's bear that in mind and launch our presentation and start through it. Perhaps, Mike, you'd like to guide us through the first element here of the briefing.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Helen. So let me just recap for, obviously, I don't know how many of you attended the first session, but in the first session, what we did, one of the things we looked at was what was actually needed from a regulatory perspective. And we picked up specifically that that whilst the FCA operational resilience requirements weren't actually applicable to everybody, the practical requirements of those provided really good general governance for all of us. That the term resilience is something that I hear, all the time. I almost sort of daily, to be honest. Now, it's so much more widely recognised now, throughout the business, which I think is great because it's understood at the board level and it's understood all the way down through the business. It doesn't matter who I'm talking to; everybody understands what resilience means, and I can relate it more easily to what they do in their job. Whereas in the past, trying to get people to understand it using the terminology that was topical was actually quite tricky sometimes to relate it to their job. And resilience is just, it's so broad, and I can actually now talk to people about the different aspects that resilience sort of means to them. And it just really helps provide good resilience in the business is clearly going to provide a good pathway to that fast and safe growth that we all want. So we saw, I'm just going to go back, and we saw one of the polls in the previous presentation. One of the members felt that their companies weren't quite fully developed enough to ensure identification and ongoing monitoring of critical parties. Now that third-party risk is just continually growing. It must be appropriately managed continually for all of our businesses to remain resilient. Now there's lots of different people on this call today, and all our firms, they're all different sizes and makeups. And although there will always going to be some similarities involving cyber, data, and regulation, above all, everybody wants we all want our firms to be resilient. Now, for some, when you consider resilience, embedding technology systems will be the answer to improving controls and efficiencies. But it's important to remember that for others, there are steps to go through first to ensure that the processes needed are understood. All of us, though, one thing's common, and we must understand that keeping processes simple is so important, and continuing to improve. And continuing to ensure. Sorry, my phone's going off. Apologies for that.
That's okay, Mike. Just Manveen, can we
Apologies.
move through the slides? I think are we supposed to be on slide 2 now?
Not quite. If that's okay.
No,
If that's
no,
okay.
sorry,
You can move there if you'd like. Sorry about that.
I'm too keen. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So but one thing's common. We must understand and keep processes simple. we've got, all stakeholders, throughout the business. It's so important that everyone is brought along the journey, in ensuring resilience, because otherwise we just won't achieve good governance. Now, let me tell you one of the ways that we did this in Pro, and this is obviously now I'm going to talk to this particular slide that's on the screen. So one of the things we wanted to do was keep it simple. So what we did was we mapped all our risks and controls for all our group entities against the regulatory requirements, against the regulatory objectives, sorry. So we treated these objectives as being the requirements for managing any business, regardless of whether they were a regulated entity or not. And this is where I think it's relevant to to what came out of the last presentation. So we found this to be an excellent way to ensure that we had group and local controls that support all clients and risk objectives. What we've since found is that it doesn't just help us look at different entities within the group. It helps us to look at different big projects that are being undertaken within the group, because we can actually think almost of it as a big project, as almost being a company, and we can make sure that all our controls apply to some sort of new project that we're working on within the business. So it's been really helpful from that perspective. Now, on the slide, what you've got there is the objectives. So these are the regulatory objectives, and then sitting behind this are more detailed expectations. Now, I haven't put up on a slide all of those detailed expectations. They can be found on the FCA website, but what I'm going to do is just take you through a few of these specifically, so that you can see how easily they might map with your own business controls and your compliance frameworks. So, and one thing you should see as we go through a few of these is a common theme: resilience. So if I just talk you through, I'm only going to talk through 5. I'm not going to talk through all of them. So if I take, business structure, senior management structure, and behaviour. So here, it's really important that we demonstrate how a business is organised, controlled, and overseen, including any outsourced arrangements. For corporate governance and risk management, it's always important to ensure that governance arrangements, internal controls, including clear organisational structures, are well defined, transparent, and consistent. For the financial crime framework, systems, controls, set of policies and procedures to manage financial crime risks, essential. IT systems, controls, business continuity and operational resilience sounds huge, doesn't it? But it is important not to underestimate the control that's needed to demonstrate robust IT systems and controls. And I think this will probably come out a bit later with Christy, talking about the technology. You must have the adequate operational and security risk management frameworks in place. The third-party relationships, obviously we talked a little bit about this last time, and I'm going to go on a little bit more about this in a minute. But it's critical here that you get the monitoring and oversight control of third-party providers correct. Now, hopefully, these 5 examples alone really demonstrate how the use of well thought out and implemented controls in a business collectively ensures our resilience. So just picking up on that third-party relationships aspect, in the last webinar, we talked about the important business services. And if you could move on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about how in Pro we set about tackling this problem a few years ago, and then making sure that we had that ongoing monitoring process. So what we have here is just very simply a sort of a summary of what we looked at really. So bit of a definition up the top there: suppliers must meet the organisation standards for financial stability, ethical conduct, etc. And that's going to help mitigate your risk and your operational exposure. So very simply, we had a risk identification, a risk assessment, the ongoing monitoring, and a continual review of process. All of those activities are not, won't be uncommon to any of you, if you're connected with compliance or risk management or operations. So we identified the risks of each of those suppliers, and assigned them as to being whether they were critical, important, or general. And you can see there's a definition to each. I won't read out them all, but I just want to focus on the one in the middle, because that's the one that's really important. Obviously, critical's going to be important, but you're not going to have loads and loads and loads of critical providers, because really we're talking about something there that could just literally, cause the organization to fail. Important ones, though, are the ones that really matter, because they're the ones that are going to lead to an element of failure that is going to have a significant impact on your business. So could be, a third party has a data risk, which is going, and you have a big, strong connection to that third party, and it's going to cause a big service disruption to your company. So those are the ones to think about. And that's just a nice, simple way that we assign a criticality to those suppliers. We've got a risk assessment and a sign off. It's quite straightforward. It's all about the sort of the due diligence. What if we apply a due diligence process to each of our suppliers depending on the category. We have our subject matter experts review these. So when the IT security questions come back, I don't necessarily review them. They go to our IT security experts. And that way we feel like we've done a really thorough due diligence check of our suppliers. We got financial and compliance checks, which my team will undertake. We've got monitoring, because this is the bit that you can't forget. You've got to either do it on an ongoing basis, and Christy will talk about this in a bit, or maybe it's something that you do once a year, but however you do it, it's got to be done. It's not just a once and done exercise. And the other important bit is, don't forget to continually review the process, because regulations change, business aspects change. So we all know AI has just gone a bit mad. So you've got to think about whether there's any AI questions that you now need to add into your due diligence. So it's things like that. So and in fact, this year we've actually changed quite a bit of our due diligence sort of process around sort of what we ask our suppliers, because of a variety of different business changes. So I hope that's helped set the scene a bit for why the right controls for resilience should be in place. And I think we'll now see shortly how technology can actually play an important part in all of these processes.
Perfect. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I've put together a really simple flow chart here, but kind of moving on from Mike's points, one of the biggest parts and the obstacles of operational resilience is just making sure that we've actually documented. So what is it we actually need? What is the process flow that we think we're going to follow? And what does the outcome need to be? We need to make sure we've got the roles and responsibilities. What are you asking of technology? Where does it sit? But where do you ultimately not necessarily need it? You need the controls in place, but technology won't fill all of the gaps. And understanding how that process flow and what your obligations are is really important from the outset. So before kind of looking at going, right, there's all these great new systems that say they'll do everything. What is it actually that you're trying to achieve? Because you don't then necessarily want to add in another vendor with a tool if you have done the due diligence internally, looked at like how you're operating and documented that process. So this gives a standardization for everyone to really follow. And then a step that we think is really important is actually reviewing the technology that you have available to you. So, for most of us, we really do work in quite a technically enabled environment, but what we don't do is kind of fully utilize that environment to its best of its capabilities. So, for instance, you can, in the outset, if you're not looking to harness a full system, instead of using a spreadsheet, look at your SharePoint sites and generating things like SharePoint lists. And off of that, you can use basic flows and automations to trigger alerts and checks and re-reviews that you might need to do of your vendors. you know, you can make that so that it's a central repository for people to go to, because, you know, coming out of the first poll, one of the first points is around data. Now, really, your main point of focus is making sure your data is centrally managed, and that process and documentation is in place that, you know, even from a technology and a compliance team's perspective, if I'm not in and Mike's not in, someone else can pick it up and run with it, because that's also part of operational resilience, right? It doesn't just come down to your technology and your vendors. So we like to look at it in kind of a bit of a staged approach, because you won't get to kind of that utopian view of everything being automated and, you know, that all kind of sequentially happening around you until you really understand what it is you're trying to achieve. You know, you can create automated rules and researchers within tools such as Copilot, that if you harness them correctly, and sometimes granted this takes skill, but looking at specific websites like the FCA for specific types of updates to then, you know, have that automate into a list. These are kind of small changes that can incrementally help a team in being able to achieve, you know, a more technically driven goal. But actually, I think what we've found, and as Mike alluded to in the slides, is that actually by doing a lot of the processes internally and the mapping, you find a lot of efficiency gains anyway. So just making sure you use your toolbox correctly to kind of assist you, I think is really important. Could we move on to the next slide, please? And here we've just kind of added on a bit around the vendor audit process. So giving you a bit of a schematic. Oh, sorry, we've gone one too many. Just giving you a bit of a process flow here on kind of, it doesn't need to, the first iteration of that documentation doesn't need to be heavy. It just needs to identify what it is you need to do in these individual processes and what are you trying to achieve. So at the end of a vendor process for us, it's making sure that we've got those validations in place that we're checking every year. You know, our processes and our audit changes definitely every year with, you know, how technology is moving, how regulations change. So having those annual touch points is really quite important, but really just starting from a basic flow point for us is really important.
Are we moving on to the next slide, or would you like me to hop into some
questions?
Yeah,
the next question, not next slide.
You want me to hop into the questions now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
That's okay, no worries. Well, look, you know, there is a lot to digest there. I was kind of zooming in manually on the diagram as well, and very interesting to try and hone in on some of the practical takeaways. So one of the questions I was going to ask, just reflecting back on Mike's slides, is that policy to practice framing. So from your experience, Mike, I guess this one's for initially, what are the most effective practical steps that companies can take to embed operational resilience in their day-to-day governance structures?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Helen. So yeah, it's interesting just looking at you know, that flow chart there. There's obviously, yeah, a lot of steps. Yeah, and one of the interesting things that we see as well is we don't just see it from the perspective where we might want to look at our vendors, you know, but actually we also see, you know, we have, you know, clients that are looking at us. So we're also seeing other best practice as well. So it's quite nice to sort of be able to to look at it from both sides, and be a part of that flow chart, I suppose, from both sides. So that was just an interesting observation I made just as I was looking at that. But it is, in answer to your question, Helen, it's really important to, you know, to ensure from the top down that there's the right buy-in all the way. I've outlined obviously that resilience is more widely understood now, and it's very helpful that that's the case. But yeah, it must be presented to the board and senior executive teams as a collective initiative that everyone has responsibility for. It's not just one person's responsibility. You know, when we've in the past, everyone has talked about business continuity and said it's, you know, it's everybody's responsibility. It's the same with operational resilience. It's just that when we think about operational resilience, it's just a bit broader. It thinks about a lot more than just a business continuity plan, you know, and the traditional things that would have been in there. We're starting to look at third parties, data, you know, all of those sorts of risks as well. So let me just give you a practical example though of how we took some steps within our business. So what we found was that resilience controls were really fast becoming a key part of our client contracts. So it was just becoming whole sections of our contracts were all about operational resilience. So what we did was we established first an overarching operational resilience policy. So really by that, what I mean was that we recognized that there were multiple things that were relevant. So we just created this simple overarching policy that people could refer to, and it told them what else was relevant. It outlined to all staff all of the component business and compliance policies and procedures that were relevant when thinking about resilience, and then combined with awareness sessions, the typical compliance attestations that they have to make as staff, combined with with that, the awareness sessions to them and the senior executives and managers, everybody then began to understand what resilience was. So by understanding that, obviously was the first step. Now, second step was that operational resilience, we found when we started to think about it more, was that it was a natural fit to the governance, risk and compliance team that I lead. We were already looking at due diligence, we were already responding to client audits. So it felt natural. We were already looking at business continuity, data protection, all of those sorts of things. So what we did was we started to look at our processes, and we made sure that the governance was right. So we made sure that we had appropriate steering group, for the period that we needed it. We made sure that we reported into the risk committee. We also reassessed our own incident response program to make it more agile. It was just too cumbersome before, and now we have a much more agile one that is resilient in itself as well, which is really helpful, which means we can actually, if we have an incident that requires that sort of response, we can actually act far quicker. Well, and then also what we did was we made sure that there was continual testing, monitoring across the business, because obviously that's so key. So, it's that size, scale and presentable risks. We just got to think about all of those sorts of things. They're the things that determine, what's right for a company. But as I said, so all our actions have been important, but they're phased. So I think that's the most important thing, Helen.
It's really interesting to hear your perspective as well, both as a sort of consultant, a trusted advisor in the market, letting other companies know how best to structure this, but also from your own experience in implementing operational resilience at scale within a business. So thanks for that. Now, Christy, just picking up on what you said earlier, you talked us through standardization and control around the must-haves from a technology perspective in the operational resilience toolkit, for want of a better word. And you also spoke about visibility and automation in part one of this two-part series of webinars, which is just something I want to pick up on now, because I know it was highlighted in the poll too at the start of this webinar. So you've given really clear insight in how to start and not balloon costs straight away. But how do you see an audit process to enhance operational resilience actually working? If that's not too big a question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does start with kind of thinking about the basics of what are you trying to achieve So from a vendor audit perspective, you know, we have seen examples where the questioning can be extremely thorough, but almost sometimes to the point of, you know, contradicting questions ahead. So really thinking about what it is you want to achieve and the answers you want to obtain from your vendors. And making sure that that audit process is something that the business units can really use. Because often when you're looking, especially at a vendor, you know, it may be that, you know, a claims team are looking at a new claims system, and you want them to understand the risks as well, or, you know, the operational impact that would be had through having this vendor. But if you make it such in a way that, you know, it's so hard to decipher that information, or it takes, you know, a long time to get them the answers that they need to make a decision, you know, that's when I think you start to kind of trip yourself up in this. I mean, you can use technology now to summarize. So, you know, also a really neat way is like things like forms, kind of already digitally getting that information, and kind of categorizing effectively. So understanding, to Mike's point, you know, there's parts of the process that he will just send to my team for security review, and that technical information, but making sure, is there an easy way you find that to summarize this back to the business for them to understand the risks or anything that they need to take on board from this process? Because, you know, no vendor comes without any, you know, operational risk that you need to manage. That's just part and parcel of what we do, right? So it's just, how do you then get that information and use technology to assist in summarizing that back to them and telling them the position and making that data available to everyone, I think is quite an important piece. Obviously, if it, you know, is used quite frequently, but, you know, in terms of a term, but AI can assist you in some of the answers and summarization. But first, I would always say start with looking at how you've categorized the data you're collecting and why, and what you expect in your outcome to be. Because then that can drive business efficiencies and decisions on whether, you know, operationally this either hinders or harnesses or, you know, assists them in moving forward.
That's very interesting. And I think for me, almost comforting as well to know that nobody, I imagine, is in this perfect utopia of being completely operationally resilient. We're all somewhere on that line, aren't we? Somewhere on that journey. And perhaps just picking up on some of your points there to ask Mike a question about technology now. You know, firms are juggling multiple carriers, multiple outsourcing partners, all these different relationships. From your point of view, how does technology strengthen audit and assurance functions?
Sure, yeah, it does definitely. I think because it certainly, you know, it certainly allows for more transparency of controls and processes, and often in real time as well. Something that, you know, years ago we couldn't do. You know, it was a, you know, once whenever somebody thought about, you know, catching up on this sort of thing. So it gives us a strong, consistent approach, and I like that. You know, it's just really helpful. You're really good that we can see, you know, our vendors in this sort of way, and also it gives us that, you know, we can change things, you know, sort of quickly. I talked earlier about, you know, if you had new regulations, new things that come in, you might want to change. You know, the technology would actually gives you the ability to do that faster. You could sort of, so you can implement those sort of changes a bit quicker. Now, you know, Christy touched on AI as well, and how, you know, and the uses for it. But obviously, there's much talk now at the moment about how enabling technology and AI can improve our businesses. But, you know, as I said earlier, it's important to remember, just like Christy said, that, you know, whilst that's true, a phased approach is probably going to be the best approach. You know, when we in Pro started down this sort of journey, we didn't go straight into the full-blown technology approach. You know, we started with a, I think Christy touched on it earlier, with the whole sort of thinking about what you can do on SharePoint, that sort of thing. So those things, that's if you haven't done anything, that's a great place to start. But above all, the one thing I would suggest that everyone thinks about is governance, making sure you've got the right governance in place, because as you evolve this process, you will find that you need to have it. Boards will expect it, so senior management teams will expect it. So always have a think about that first.
That's very interesting. I think that's, this governance is almost like a cultural change that's taking place as well. And as you said earlier, the idea of collaboration, this is an effort that permeates throughout a business. So Christy, just picking up on that, how do you feel compliance and audit teams can work hand in hand with technology teams to build a single view of risk across a business?
Yeah, I think this really leads on from what Mike was just saying. I mean, operational resiliency at its core is the ability of an organisation to prevent, adapt to, respond to, recover from, and learn from operational disruption, whether that's kind of business or technical. I think you really need to have kind of defined common risks, so a business understanding of whether it's operational, cyber, vendor, conduct, finance, regulatory, resilience, whatever that may be. You need to have defined that and agreed in principle how those each would be managed. And agree on the shared definitions and the kind of the risk rating, the impact, the likelihood, the criticality, because that really does make a difference in kind of the effectiveness of how kind of risks are managed. And I do keep mentioning it, but a control library in a better sense, but a data repository where everyone knows where that data is held, whether they have read-only access or they have view, or to their specific items. One of the most damaging things can be when data is all over the place and not being managed consistently, because no one can then get to the answer as to the operational risk that they are actually managing. So therefore, this is where technology can be really powerful. And let's not overthink it in the beginning. Let's just make this something where there's a process, there is a central repository where we can manage this together, and we all have common understanding of what our risks appetite is, and the definitions and the types of controls that we need in place.
A control library, I'm writing it down. You're right, and this standard understanding of what we're trying to quantify here. Now, boards, as you said earlier, need to be notified, need to be brought along on this process, and obviously the buck stops with the board in any incident that occurs. So, Mike, to your mind, what role does that board level oversight play in ensuring resilience isn't just delegated, but it's actually owned at the top level?
No, absolutely. I think I've touched on this pretty much throughout my presentation actually today, but just to bring in what Christy was just saying about data, it's so important that the right data goes up to the board, so that the board is can understand the way that the business is operating and that the business is resilient. So, good data throughout will mean good data that goes up to the board. I've certainly seen, a shift over the years on boards around, thinking about this topic, looking at risks and risk management, and then moving towards thinking, very heavily, particularly as we went through the COVID years, thinking about business continuity and how we were all operating, that then shifted to me thinking more about resilience, because obviously resilience was now so much more. I think, so that was the point. It all started to shift. So yeah, it's been really interesting watching that develop on the boards that I sit on, and I think it's great to see that the boards are so much more interested in resilience. They challenge the senior management understand it, so everybody understands it, and then it pushes down through the business. Everybody buys into it, and in turn what you have is a company that can grow, as I said earlier, can grow safely, and in a controlled manner that has strong growth as a result.
Christy, is there anything that you would add to that from a cultural perspective in terms of what firms can do to make resilience more than a compliance exercise, something that they can actually understand and act on?
Yeah, we've done a lot of role play scenarios, which I think we alluded to those in the last session as well. But getting people thinking about what operational resilience is, like, COVID is a really good example, of a lot of organizations at that point didn't have a setup where people could work remotely. So it took, a lot of clamoring around, and a lot of hardware orders in a pre-testing time for people to get, staff mobile outside of the office. And, that may be an okay risk control because that's an extreme event. But it's kind of role playing through even at a base scenario. So what do you do if a system is offline? How do you manage your day? What would be the types of controls? We found that can be really beneficial, kind of from a user perspective, and just getting engagement and an understanding.
Mike, is there anything further you'd add to that? Are there any other slides you'd like to go through before we invite some questions?
No, I'm good, thank you. That's fine, thank you. No.
Fantastic. Well, look, that was very interesting. There's a lot to take away from the presentation today, and I thought we'd just move towards the live poll question again, and just a reminder to all those tuned in to have a think about asking questions to our experts on the panel today. It is quite rare to get a tech expert and a compliance expert that aren't working in silos, that are here together to talk about operational resilience. So really anything that you might be thinking in terms of responding to the regulation that's in play at the moment, what's coming down the line, please have a think, pop it in the chat, and I will put your question to the panel as we move towards the end. But for now, let's ask that question again. So it's the same question we asked at the start, but let's just see if sentiment has shifted at all. I believe, Manveen, you've kindly put that back in the chat again. So we've got the same question again here. So where do you see the greatest opportunity for improvement in your cultural approach, current operational resilience approach? Is it data quality and visibility? Is it continuous vendor oversight, governance and accountability, technology enablement, or all of the above? And just a recap of the first set of answers, 26% said data quality and visibility, 21% continuous vendor oversight, just 5% felt it was governance and accountability, 13% technology enablement, and 34% went for all of the above. I'm starting to feel like we shouldn't have included that as an answer because that may be the right answer. Or maybe there's no such thing as a right answer. Let's see what Mike and Chrissy say. We've had 25 responses so far, and a few more coming in. The majority leaning towards all of the above. And there's been a little bit of a shift away from data quality and visibility. I think certainly more people are feeling it's a combined effort, but I'll hand over perhaps Mike to reflect first on the responses to that poll.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's probably what I would expect. Certainly the presentation, as you'll have seen, shows that resilience and vendor sort of management is actually all about all of those parts, all of those aspects. So a shift towards all of the above is kind of what I would expect. It's interesting also that sort of there's a couple there for sort of governance and accountability, which obviously I've obviously mentioned quite a lot. So it's good to see that that. But I suppose that might depend on where people are on their journey, as to sort of what they think will be, what they will get most from from each of those parts. So yeah, so it's pretty much what I would expect. But yeah.
Christine, any reflections? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it always is a blend of the above, and depending on where you are in the journey, kind of highlights to yourself where you'll be focusing on more. So no, it's good to see changes and reflection through the session.
Yeah, interesting. I think you've brought a lot practically to the table here. Now, look, I want to invite some questions from the audience. If you have any, please do add them to the chat. I have a handful of my own, if that's okay. But I'll keep an eye out too on any coming in. Oh, here we go. One from Crispin. Hello, Crispin. Thank you for your question. Crispin asks, how do you manage annual vendor due diligence audits when that vendor is Microsoft Azure, Databricks, or Amazon Web Services? So I think this is touching on that real critical vendor point that you made, but over to you guys, let us know.
Yeah, I think this one is there's twofold. So obviously they have standard T's and C's that we do have reviewed annually, but I mean they're changing daily depending on the technology and elements that you're implementing. We run this slightly differently in terms of our due diligence of what we are doing on those platforms instead. So how are we using them? What controls have we got in place to manage the risk that appetite of using a cloud platform comes with? So your policies and restrictions that you have around Databricks or Azure, and its accessibility to the wider business and externally from outside. So that actually we do ensure that we have annual pen tests on those services too. So as part of that operational resiliency, checking ourselves for any kind of weakness within them, because I mean, I guess the question comes from the fact that there's not really much you can do about their policies. Microsoft aren't going to change their T's and C's for any of us really. So we do keep ourselves cognizant to any of the changes that they're making, but we do perform the due diligence actually on the way we utilize the cloud services more so.
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. So it's more about your awareness of your own usage and what an outage, how that could impact you, rather than pushing back on T's and C's, as you say, that aren't necessarily going to be flexible at that level. Mike, any points? Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. There was just one final point on kind of an operational resiliency. It's something we've talked about a lot is kind of having different clouds for kind of your disaster recovery or backups, or there's been a lot of thought in the market over the last few years around kind of immutable vaults, so off system copies, and I think that's a lot about keeping in touch with kind of world news and what's kind of going on in the world of technology and politics to understand the risk.
Mike, is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, so to just to pick up really on what Christy has said, one I mentioned earlier that our incident response team. So one of the things we sat down and did when we reformed that was Christy's part of that incident response team, and what we actually did was we sat down as a group and actually sort of just went through some of these challenges. What if there was an issue with Microsoft, what would we do? So just that really just sort of backs up what Christy's sort of saying that we do. It's not about necessarily you can't necessarily go and do the due diligence, but you can make sure that you understand your risk, understand what you might do in the event of of something going wrong.
Very interesting. And I suppose as well how much you've automated along the way in terms of your resilience reporting will have an impact on how quickly you can respond as well. And I wonder, that's one of the questions I had in if I'll keep an eye out for any others coming through, but how do you balance automation with regulatory control? Is there a view there on how accepted that is?
How do we balance automation with regulatory control? I suppose this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where we will look at what we're doing, with regards to what's the regulation, business sort of changes, that sort of thing, and we will think about what we need to ask. And how what parts of that we might automate. I suppose it's a balance, I suppose. I mean, I can't really sort of explain it any other way than that. You know, obviously we aren't necessarily automating all our processes all at once, but equally we have to make sure that we are looking at the regulation first and foremost, you know, but at the same time thinking about, you know, where automated processes make it better, but also help support the regulation. You know, so yeah, that sort of answered it.
I threw in a tricky question. Sorry, it's the former journalist in me. I can't help it. Christy, do you have any views on that at all?
I agree with Mike. It's a balance. I think one of the things that we have looked at are kind of aligning ourselves with compliance strategies around the use of technology. So making sure from the project phase through that you've got the right intent with when you're using automation. And you're making sure that you've got the right boundaries and perimeters and the right security and vendor checks on what you're using the technology for, to make sure that you are continually evolving the business, but also keeping the data safe.
Quite, yeah, that's a very good takeaway there. Well, look, you know, we're at risk of we've really sort of raced through the presentation here, and if I'll keep an eye out for any other questions, and do please have a think. And if anything occurs to you, you know, after the webinar, as you watch the recording, and as you're working through your processes, just do get in touch. Our contact details are available as well. But just some closing reflections, I think, as we move towards the end. Perhaps I could ask each of you to share one key action you'd recommend MGA specifically take after today, something practical they can begin working with, you know, this quarter. Mike, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Yeah, sure. I don't think it will come as any surprise to anyone that, you know, coming from the area that I work in, you know, have a look at your governance. I genuinely believe that if you've got that right, you know, it will drive everything else, you know. So you know, and if it isn't there, you know, but don't overdo it. You really don't need to overdo it, you know, but what you need is, you know, for implementing anything around operational resilience and the due diligence, whatever, you just need a full business engagement, you know, so that you can get that, you can get it designed, you can get it implemented, and then you can get the assurance. But if you don't have the governance in place, you know, to discuss each of those parts and agree, or, you know, and put the data that comes out of it into it, you know, into those governance meetings, it will fall apart. So I think it's just so important. Start with the governance and go from there.
Thanks, Mike. Same question to you, Chrissy.
Yeah, I think it comes back to my point on, you know, generate a data map, make sure you know where the data is held, and those who you deem are accountable in those processes, that they know where that data is and how that process operates, and the right way to be able to triage to you any issues or incidents, because you want to create that open door policy where people feel like they can let you know of any incidents that are coming around as well, because it doesn't just fall to, you know, automated processes or getting that information. You do need people to come forward and let you know, but being able to do things like build researchers to kind of look at the websites that you need to on a daily, weekly basis, they're really helpful and powerful.
That's a really good point about the culture, though. It's not something that you should shy away from reporting and from going up the ladder with if you see a point of weakness in operational resilience or a potential breach. And I think culturally we've still got a way to go with that. Well, look, thank you to Mike and Christy for your perspectives. It's been really insightful, and thank you, of course, to the Managing General Agents Association for hosting, and to everyone who's joined us today. Operational resilience and vendor oversight, they're not static compliance goals. I think that's one of my key takeaways here. They're living processes. They depend on good data, good governance, good cultures, and collaboration across segments of a business. So if you missed part one, the recording is available on the MGAA website and on YouTube, and goes a lot into the specifics of the regulations involved that we mentioned at the start. both at European level and at UK level. And this recording from part 2 will be available in the coming days. So yeah, thank you again very, very much to the MGAA for hosting, and to the experts from Pro Global for leading this important conversation. Any questions, any follow-up, just get in touch, and we'll share our contact information with you afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
all. And just a quick reminder to please share any feedback you've got with us. I've just popped a link in, and I thank you again to you all for your time today, and thank you for those coming and joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.